If you are listening to the show and wish to join us in the chat room, visit paltalk.com. Go to the social issues, select other, and enter the UFO Paranormal Radio Network.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Benetti, and along with Joe Montaldo, we host News on the Flip Side. Come join us every Saturday night at 7 p.m. Central for our 3-hour program. We have opinions on everything, and we're not afraid to share them. False history gets made all day, every day. The truth of the new is never on the news, but you can find it here with News on the Flip Side. Remember, don't be politically correct. Just be correct. Join us.
Our program, Global Newsmaker Focus, with co-host Vernell and Patrice, is broadcast weekly on Saturday nights on United Public Radio and UPRN 107.7 FM New Orleans, Louisiana, and 107.9 FM and 105.3 FM Henderson Pass, Christian, Mississippi. This is Patrice Sheridan speaking, and here are some biography details on tonight's guest, author and political commentator Tom Ufert. Mr. Ufert is an inspirational voice in our troubled times. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and History as a scholarship recipient from Centenary College of Louisiana. Tom is a former Rotary International Graduate Fellow who attended Australian National University in Canberra, specializing in East Asian political affairs, and was a White House Fellow nominee. He is a former Lyndon Baines Johnson congressional intern and constituency aide for 2 former United States members of Congress. His past services for 11 political campaigns on both sides of the aisle were highly valued by former Louisiana Governor Charles Buddy Roemer, Henson Moore, the former Assistant Chief of Staff to U.S. Vice President George H.W. Bush, and the recently retired U.S. Trade Ambassador Ron Kirk. At age 23, Tom Ufert was the youngest artistic board chairman in the United States as head of the Shreveport Summer Music Festival. Mr. Ufert has served as a member of 2 other 501c3 charity boards, including his beloved fraternity, Phi Mu Alpha Sinfonia, as well as the Community Advisory Board for his former rehabilitation hospital. Over the years, he has acquired extensive customer service experience in the food and beverage, hotel, insurance, home security, and pharmaceutical industries, include Phi Alpha Theta, Sigma Tau Delta, and the worldwide who's who. In recent years, he has worked tirelessly as a volunteer fundraiser for numerous AIDS charities in his community and served briefly as the community affairs liaison for Legacy Founders Cottage. Tom Ufert, a native of Louisiana, now resides in Texas. He is an Amazon best-selling author. For his second book, On the Roll Again, Bill's character received high acclaim with numerous 5-star reviews, as has his newest release, Political Craps. In fact, all 3 books have garnered distinction as Amazon's top 20 bestsellers. Perhaps Mr. Ufert's greatest claim to fame is that every book he sells contributes directly to charity through his charitable book entity, Stand Strong for Others. I'd like to note to our listeners that Tom's website can be found at TomUfert, TOMUFERT.com, which can be found at, of course, Facebook.com/Tom Ufert Author. Tom, it's such a privilege to have you as a guest on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Patrice. I'm glad to be here. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
And, Tom, Vernell may be joining us during the show. Right now, she presently has a bad cold. I myself, I think I'm coming down with a cold, as so many of the Phoenix residents. Your book, Political Craps, is a fascinating and very informative read. You also, though, have some research and expertise on Louisiana, as well as many other political campaigns and current political developments, including there with the congressional district.
Forgive me,
can you hear me?
Up. You're
okay.
breaking up some.
Joe, are you still on the line? I'm sure he is. Tom, you have, not only did I wish to discuss Political Craps, but also you've done some research regarding the campaign in the Congressional District 6 regarding Edwin Edwards. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah, your questions are breaking up.
Joe, can you hear us? Also in the room, can you hear us? It could be a bit of a lag.
Yeah, your questions. I can't.
I know England are. I'm wondering if we should start the conference call again. Joe should be right back. I know one of our wonderful listening audience members, Ian, is saying from England he can hear them, but there's a bit of a lag.
Yes.
Well, let's just see. Joe should be right back, and I think that Joe will probably reset when he comes back. Tom,
okay.
Should we begin anyway? I'd love, for example, my first question is, you've undertaken recent research on this past 2014 election regarding the campaign with Congressional District 6 and Edwin Edwards.
Yeah, I had, in anticipation of tonight's show, having been a former resident of Louisiana for most of my life, and I did my research this afternoon, pulling up voting records and statistics on the 2014 midterm elections, specifically addressing the Senate race with Mary Landrieu, which I understand is now going to be into a runoff in December. But specifically, U.S. House District Seat 6, where a former political nemesis of mine, Edwin Edwards, has, been released from prison and is now running for Congress. Interestingly enough, in 1987, I ran the youth campaign for former Louisiana Governor Charles Buddy Romer in the race against Edwin Edwards. And so I have some very personal opinions about Edwin Edwards. And I have to admit, I once met him in New Orleans many years ago when I was there for a fraternity leadership conference. I refused to shake the man's hand because I don't respect him. And I'm very surprised that he is running for Congress. He's 81 or 82 years old. I saw him being interviewed on CNN, and interestingly enough, he says that God still has a mission for him. Well, I hope and pray that voters in Louisiana do not easily dismiss his 9 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement as, just something to joke about. This man is not someone that I trust, and I sincerely hope my fellow Louisianians don't trust him either. From what I can tell from the voting records that were released from the Secretary of State's office, In House District Seat 6, there were 53% of the vote of registered voters turned out, and Edwin Edwards was leading with 30.12% of the registered voters. That comes to about 77,852 votes, while his nearest competitor was Garrett Graves. They will be in a runoff together. And there were 10 other candidates in the race. My goal, or at least my hope, is that if the other voters that voted for the 7 Republican candidates in that race, which comes to about 85,000 votes, all support Garrett Graves against Edwin Edwards, there is no way that Edwin Edwards can win that seat, and I hope and pray he does not.
Well, that sounds like a very interesting development and indeed an alarming one. And I'm so glad someone with your expertise there, Tom, is able to explain to the voters really the important aspects of that campaign as well. And, your book is very informative. It really strongly advocates an informed and proactive citizenry who is aware of the important issues affecting the nation and wants effective responses from their legislators and other public officials. Tom, did you view the election results of the very strong increased majority for the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives and their regaining the Republican majority in the Senate as a sign that really the Americans want a proactive turn in a new direction?
I did to some extent. My concern about the voter turnout, only 1/3 of the registered voters in this country voted in the midterm elections. And that is, when you look at voting statistics for midterm elections, they tend to decrease anywhere from 7 to 12% anyway from a national presidential campaign. However, the major concern that I have is that, as I wrote in my book, Political Craps, I considered these midterm elections and the upcoming 2016 presidential election to be monumental and crucial events in American political history. And considering that, when you look at recent public opinion polls, 69% of the people in this country complain about the direction of the country, and 65% of people say this is the worst Congress in their lifetimes. It absolutely astounds me that more people did not get out and vote. I would hesitate to venture a guess from the research that I've done since the election that if the Democrats had been able to maintain what they called the Obama coalition, they would have had a better shot at maintaining. My prediction before the election was that the Democrats were going to hold 1 or 2 seats to prevent the Republicans. And I was strongly in support of Mr. Orman in Kansas as the independent senator, because I think this country is in desperate need of major leadership transition at the national level. And that includes both sides of the aisle, because as my former mentor, Buddy Roemer of Louisiana, used to say when he was running for president in 2012, he said, both political parties, they're connected to the wallet. And my biggest concerns in this country include voter turnout, redistricting and gerrymandering, as well as political campaign finance reform. And unfortunately, neither political party seems at all interested in reversing those trends.
Very interesting response there, Tom. And your book, Political Craps, again, a wonderful read, is based on,
Thank you.
Am I correct, your concept that the situation in politics now is so risky. Even the book cover, Political Craps, shows a crap board. And I hope I correctly reference this, that your name, Political Craps, indicates the risk nature of the American political scene at this time. Also, Craps is an acronym you've chosen for the words compromise, rancor, affluence, policy, and stupidity. And again, your book it really shows extensive research on the American political scene from the early days of our republic through the current era. And mentioning compromise, you have a great chapter on that. You note such great examples as Nixon and his approach to China, and Nixon's negotiation on nuclear arms reduction with the Soviet Union, as well as two legislators who retired, Senator Olympia Snowe, Republican of Maine, and Joe Lieberman of New York.
Yes.
Your belief that compromise is important sounds very insightful. Any further comments on that?
Yeah, thank you. Patrice, you hit that nail right on the head. And yes, you aptly described the three components in the title, Political Craps. My firm belief is that the two political parties have become so polarized, and it has caused a major dissolution of moderation in the political scenery in this country. Let's face it, most of the American citizens in this country assign themselves in middle of the road status, and when you've got both political parties that are on the fringe, whether they be strong liberal or strong conservative, it really is striking that we can't reach any kind of resolute compromise in Congress to solve the problems that the nation has. And that is exactly why we are where we are today. And unfortunately, everyone was, singing Kumbaya after the election. Everyone was going to, saying, oh, yes, we're going to work together and blah, blah, blah. But the very next day, you had the soon-to-be majority leader, Mitch McConnell, come out, draw a line in the sand about immigration. The president, 45 minutes later in his press conference, drew a line in the sand about immigration. And then the day after that, Speaker of the House, John Boehner, drew his line in the sand on immigration. And then yesterday, when they had their wonderful meeting at the White House, no one was able to come out and smile with any confidence for the American people that they're going to work together on these issues. And yet we've got major, major issues affecting this country. And what we need are people in the middle who are going to bridge the gap and moderate compromise. And, that was the reason I chose that particular subject in the book, was because, I do not believe compromise means that you have to give up your principles. But it does mean that you have to come together, be willing to disagree. You agree to disagree on issues, but you also have to be willing to give a little to get a little. And the American people expect our elected representatives to do that. I mean, the foundations of this country are based on compromise, and I wrote about that in the book about, Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention, and he was approached by a woman on the street, and she said, Mr. Franklin, what kind of a government have you given us? And he looks at her very frankly, and he says, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. And this is where we are today. When you have the two fringes of both political parties, especially minorities in each party, that are restricting the leadership from doing what needs to be done. I mean, you've got John Boehner, who's so strangleholded by the Tea Party caucus in the House, and you've got Harry Reid that is so stranglepartied by the far left in his party, that bills can't be put on the floor for members of Congress to debate. That's not the way Congress is supposed to work. And if the American voters don't, forgive my French, Patrice, get off their butts and force change, then this is going to continue to happen at our own peril.
Those are very insightful comments there, Tom. And, I want to note here as well that on the network, including on the flagship news program, News on the Flip Side, both co-hosts, Joe Montaldo and Stephanie Benetti, have been mentioning a new type of party, a moderate or middleist view party. So I think that perhaps many of our listeners are interested in that moderate and middleist view stance. So indeed, I think people agree with your insightful ideas there as to the importance of compromise. And, you have a great statements in your book about the fact that compromise can produce progress. And, on the Tea Party, we can mention that later as well. I found that very informative as well. You were mentioning, it really helped explain it more to me as well. I find that particular Republican development very, very interesting. You mentioned that they emphasize fiscal responsibility, the curbing of excessive spending, balancing the budget, and I'd forgotten this, it's very true. They want to promote an amendment to balance the budget in the U.S. Constitution. But you also were mentioning that with any reduction of the budget and other financial concerns, there also has to be a very strong focus on logic. Now, Congressman Paul Ryan of Wisconsin does seem like very much a fiscal brain, but I think your point is very, very on point, that it's wonderful to propose a stance, but it always has to fulfill all the elements of logic there.
Definitely. And, your mention of Senator Rand Paul, he's one of the few Republicans right now that is proposing what I think are legitimate and viable solutions to bridge the gap for the Republican Party. When you look at the demographics in this country, this past midterm election, all of the statistics show that the voters who turned out, the 1/3 of the American voters that turned out for this election, were whiter, were older, and were more male. Well, that doesn't fit with the demographics that this country is facing as the years go by. Consequently, the Republicans are going to have to reach out and reach more Latino voters. They're going to have to reach out and take in more women voters, and they're going to have to reach out and take out more African American voters, because those are the growing demographics in this country. The Democrats, unfortunately, have made promises to all three of these groups and haven't lived up to their promises. And consequently, all three of these groups are feeling alienated, and they're feeling disengaged. So that's one of the reasons they didn't come out and vote this past election. And, Patrice, I have to be real honest with you, I don't blame the average American voter, because they get apathetic, they get turned off. There is so much noise out there during an election season, they can't make head or tails of it. And that's the reason I wrote the book the way I did, because every aspect, there are over 230 sources in the bibliography, every single piece of information in this book came off the internet. It is all public information. And I wrote it that way because I wanted to emphasize to the American people, the information's out there. You just have to go find it.
Indeed, the book is very well researched and has very, very insightful ideas, including your concepts on the issues that must immediately be addressed by legislators. And Tom, at this point, lest I forget, I'd like to have you mention some details on your mentor, former Congressman and Governor Charles Buddy Roemer of Louisiana, and what made him such an effective servant of the people.
Oh, well, I cannot speak highly enough of Buddy Roemer. He and I first met when I was 17 years old. It was 1983. He was my then member of Congress from the 4th Congressional District in Shreveport, Louisiana. He came to my high school, Loyola College Prep, and I was the recipient of that year's Daughters of the American Revolution Good Citizen Award. And we cemented our friendship from day one. We're both standing in front of the podium in front of, a cheering crowd. And I leaned over, covered the microphone, I leaned over to Buddy, and I said, "Isn't it amazing what a nice haircut and coat and tie can do for you nowadays?" And he chuckled. He leaned in and he whispered to my ear. He said, "How do you think I got elected to Congress?" And ever since, we've been good friends. In 1986, I was very fortunate that he nominated me to be his Lyndon Baines Johnson congressional intern on Capitol Hill. And then in 87, when he decided to run for governor against Edwin Edwards, he was a Democrat. He was a bold, evil Democrat at that time. his daughter Caroline and I were attending Centenary College together in Shreveport, and Caroline came to me and she said, "Tom, you're the most politically astute, young person I know. Dad has asked me to run his youth campaign, and I have no idea what to do. Can you help me out?" Well, it turned out within a matter of days and weeks, I ended up becoming head of the youth campaign for Buddy Roemer, and one of the proudest moments of my life. I have a photograph somewhere. I've been looking for it for a long time. It's been packed away somewhere. But there is a black and white photograph that night, Victory Night, in Shreveport at the Sheraton Hotel, where I and my fellow student volunteers are up on the stage cheering, leading the crowd of about 1,200, 1,500 campaign supporters in cheers as Buddy came on stage. And he's standing there with his arms wrapped behind us. And Buddy offered me a job, and unfortunately I told him, I said, I have to finish my degree here at Centenary before I can do that, and then I was nominated to go to Australia. So I wasn't able to take him up on his offer, but Buddy was the only candidate in 2012. He was running for president as a Republican. He had switched parties after his first term as governor. He switched parties because he felt that the Democrats were losing touch with the voters. So he switched to the Republicans. And I, myself, was mentored and trained as a Reaganite Republican. So I felt, in touch with what he was saying at that time in the mid to late 80s. And in fact, I had been on the phone that afternoon with the state Republican Party chairman, and he told me, "Tom, I'd love to chat with you right now, but I'm on my way to the governor's mansion." I said, "The governor's mansion? You're going to go see Buddy?" And he said, "Yeah. The news hasn't hit yet, but he's going to switch parties." And I was blown away completely. But Buddy was the only candidate in 2012 to have experience as a congressman, to have executive experience as a governor, and to have business experience running a very successful bank in South Louisiana, and to have his MBA from Harvard. And he had stood up and tried to get on the debate scene during the Republican primaries to emphasize his opinions on campaign finance reform and getting big money out of politics. And the Republicans refused to let him on the stage. They kept changing the standards they required for a candidate to be in the debate series. So he left the Republicans that year and ran as an independent for Americans Elect. And Buddy's whole philosophy was, if I can get 100,000 people in this country to donate $100, then I have a successful campaign. Throughout his entire political career, Buddy refused to accept PAC money, he refused to accept corporate donations, and he limited all personal donations to his campaign to $100. That's the kind of candidate this country needs. And I am a firm believer Buddy was the most honest politician I have ever worked for in my life.
He sounds like a man of truly great integrity. And,
yes.
There's another discussion, too, as regarding the need for moderation politics. You mentioned as one of the reasons for the decrease in party moderates is the push to win party prominence in state legislatures. And you have some very informative discussions on the use of gerrymandering and the creation of safe seats. And you mentioned that
yes.
Justice John Paul Stevens, a retired Supreme Court justice, would agree with your opinions. Those are very interesting concepts. Excuse me.
Definitely. And I don't think the average American understands how this process works. In most of the states in this country, a significant majority of the states in this country, at the end of every 10 years when the census is done, the majority party that controls the state legislature sets up the redistricting commissions. Those redistricting commissions then go about to set up the districts for congressional campaign districts, which decides based on the census information. And the way that it's been done is that the majority party tends to gerrymander the districts. And if anyone has looked at the maps in their states regarding the various congressional districts, you can't help but wonder if these people were on some kind of drugs or something, because the way they wiggle and wave, and the way they've done it is they have picked areas of the state that fit the voting statistics to help the majority party in the legislature. So consequently, what you have developed now are what are known as safe seats. In other words, you have seats that the majority party, they can run any candidate in their party, and they are guaranteed a seat. And once they've got it, they've pretty much got it for life. For example, in this last midterm election, according to CNN CinePac poll, out of 535 electoral districts, congressional districts that were up for re-election, there were only 35 competitive races in this entire country because of safe redistricting seats. Now that is ridiculous. So my proposal, and what I'm hoping that I can, between now and 2020, really get a movement going in this country, is for citizens to stand up and demand that redistricting commissions be nonpartisan and they're not controlled by the majority party. Either they be judicially appointed or they be elected by the voters, so that you have an odd number of members on the commission, so that, okay, let's say there's 7-member commissions, and you have 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and an independent, or you have a 7th member that only votes if there's a tie. That way we can guarantee that there are competitive races for our congressional seats. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. It shouldn't be controlled by one party or the other.
Yes, to represent the full spectrum of the citizens, and their needs and concerns. Too, you have a great discussion regarding affluence and the notion of the equality of the American citizen, of each American citizen, and also regarding the paths or potentials for citizens to acquire wealth and influence. Tom, you advocate the importance of legislation to rectify inequalities among citizens, and also the judiciary's role, including at the apex of the Supreme Court. There's been such a talk in these Obama terms of the fact regarding equality on career paths and education. Do you think the American citizens are becoming more attuned to these concepts?
I don't know, Patrice. It concerns me. We put litmus tests on whenever a president nominates an appointee to the Supreme Court to be advised and consent on by the Senate. We put litmus tests that have a lot to do with whether or not they support or are opposed to abortion, whether or not they oppose or support gun restrictions. But my concern is, where do they stand when it comes to campaign finance? The Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, in my opinion, was without a doubt one of the worst judicial decisions that the Supreme Court has made in several decades, because this decision basically said corporations are people and they have a right to unlimited finance of campaigns, and they don't have to report on a timely basis who donates for these campaigns. Well, as I state in the book, if you have the guts to put money up for a candidate, then you should be willing to declare that proud. What are you hiding? The transparency needs to be there. And, I voted for President Obama 2 times, but I must admit that the president has not been forthcoming about the transparency that he promised this country. Likewise, the Republicans in the Congress have been obstructionist. So my book is nonpartisan in that it criticizes both Republicans, both Democrats. It criticizes both Congress and the president. And it also criticizes the voters because it's all up to us. I do a radio program every week called Tom's Take on the Lean Freak Show out of Jersey City, New Jersey, that reaches listeners in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York. And every week I do about a 1,200 word monologue called Tom's Take. And several of the takes that I have done have been addressing the fact that of what was coming up to the election, how the election results were. But at the end of each Tom's Take, I say, this is the America and the world that we live in, and it's all up to you. And that's the truth. I tried to mirror my monologues after Edward R. Murrow's from the 1950s. I'm not trying to say that I am as talented or as wonderful as Edward R. Murrow was, far from it. But I do aspire to reach people the way that he did. And that was the whole point of writing the book. And in fact, after this election, I'm already beginning to draft my sequel, which is called Political Scraps, because I'm convinced after the election, that's what the American people are left with, are political scraps.
Boy, those are fascinating comments. I definitely will want to read this book as well, and definitely hear your program as well. And indeed, and in fact, quite frankly, now we have a wonderful listener, Cobb from New Jersey, if he'd like to call in with any questions, or Glenn or any of our listeners. And meanwhile, let me just very quickly get our radio number, Cobb from New Jersey, or Glenn or any of our listeners, and the number. Joe, that number is open tonight, correct? And that number is, and I should know it by heart. Now, unfortunately, I have to actually refer to it. Excuse me. It will be coming right up. And let me see. While we're waiting, and I apologize for the slight 2-minute delay, I'd like to note as well something else, another discussion that I thought was absolutely riveting in your book. That was the importance of lobbying. You consider lobbying to be an industry. And also, on your prior comment just now, as I'm about to give the number, you mentioned that the lawmakers have to get over, or they must
call it the Beltway. So life inside the Beltway is sort of like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole. People who get elected to Washington and then they go live inside the Beltway suddenly move into this Never Never Land, and they are so insulated from what goes on in the rest of the country, and they live in a bubble of constant cocktail parties and constant fundraising. That they forget how the average American has to deal with life as we know it.
Boy, beautifully expressed there. And the number, thank you, Joe, and I just found it here, my page further down. I should have known it by heart. The number for listeners to call in is 504-273-7379. And boy, Cobb from New Jersey, both you and I will have to listen to his I'm sure it's great, his news segment there on that the New Jersey station. That certainly sounds very worthwhile.
The tapings are done on Wednesday night, and the shows are aired on Thursday afternoons. It's called the Lean Freak Show. So if you go on to just type in Lean Freak Show on the internet, they'll pull you up with the call numbers, and let me pull that up myself while I'm at it, and I can give that to you. But go on, Patrice.
Oh, great. Well, something else. Now, I lived in Washington, D.C. For a number of years. Well, actually not that many, about 2.5 to 3. right in the Northern Virginia area. And I witnessed some of this as well. You mentioned in your book, Political Craps, the revolving door of former staffers, legislators, and other public officials becoming consultants, lobbyists, and other employees for large firms and corporations. You also strongly emphasize that there should be greater time lapses between former staffers, legislators, and other public officials leaving their positions as public servants and becoming consultants or lobbyists?
I do. Right now, what the revolving door is it's a term that politicos have used for a number of years, referring to the number of elected officials, bureaucratic officials, and their staffers who leave government service and then immediately go to work as lobbyists or consultants for major firms inside the Beltway to lobby their former bosses, their former political contacts, because they have access that you and I don't have. And right now, the term limit, you have a limitation of 5 years in between leaving public office, or whether it be an appointed position or an elected position, and then being declared or registered as a lobbyist. Now, there are loopholes in the law. They can go to work as consultants for these firms and still get paid large salaries. Newt Gingrich is a perfect example. He immediately left as Speaker of the House and went to work for one of these law firms, these lobbying firms, and was hired as a consultant, making tens of thousands of dollars. He's not the only one. Republicans and Democrats all do it. It's a far more financially lucrative position than when they were working on Capitol Hill. But the problem is that they have access into the halls of power that you and I don't have. Having worked on Capitol Hill, I speak of this in the book, there were literally lines outside congressmen's doors of people who were lobbying the congressman to for their influence on pieces of legislation. Now, what most Americans don't realize, and I certainly didn't realize until I went to work on Capitol Hill, is this is not Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, okay? I had the wonderful experience of going into the Senate chamber with these high expectations that I was going to see the debates of our time between senators, and that I was going to be witnessing these great political debates. What I walked into was extremely disappointing and was a major disillusionment. Here was one senator standing in front of a technical receptionist using a dictaphone, and the staff members for the Senate chamber at their main desk there behind the dais. And that was it. There was no one else except visitors in the gallery. He was speaking to an empty chamber, and that is traditionally what happens. On Capitol Hill, most members of Congress, whether they be senators or they be congressmen, spend most of their time either fundraising or in doing committee work. And the fundraising is a large portion of it. There was a humorous yet very sad picture that one of the news shows put up several months ago. And what it was is a very well-known coffee house inside Georgetown. And on the front door of this coffee house were notices for 4 different fundraisers at 9 a.m. in the morning. 4 different political fundraisers. And they had 6 more scheduled before the day was supposed to end. And this is basically what happens when you get elected to Congress. You immediately are having to run for re-election and raise money. So my proposal, and I agree with Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig and Buddy Roemer about this, one of the ways is that you put limitations on campaign spending, and you put limitations on personal donations and corporate and PAC donations to campaigns. And then we try to do equitable public financing so that all candidates have the same access to campaigning, advertising on television. I mean, when you look at the other countries in the world, take, for example, in Great Britain, do you realize we spent $4 billion in this midterm election? $4 billion on one midterm election. That is 400 times what they spend on all of the parliamentary elections in Great Britain. That's outrageous.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Boy, that's a powerful comment. And you know, Tom, you were mentioning regarding that importance of the contributions by American voters versus the super PACs, the lobbyists, the corporations, really the tremendous importance of the ballot box to counter these lobbying influences.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you know, the whole idea of participatory democracy is one vote, you know, one person, one vote. Well, unfortunately, you've got people like the Koch brothers and others, and I don't mean to specifically mention the Koch brothers, they're the first name that comes to mind, but there's also Soros, the Soros on the Democratic side, and you've got all of these extremely wealthy individuals who contribute, and they are limited to personal contributions. But what they do is they make contributions to the political action committees, to the super political action committees. They make what are known as bundled contributions. And they can do it through their subsidiary companies. They can do it through their family members. Now, interestingly enough, here was an interesting statistic that I found before the election. At the end of the summer, when they had I think it was the third quarter registration that is required by law for lobbyists, there were 79 new lobbyists in Washington, D.C. No, there were 85, sorry. And of the 85, 79 members, 79 of those 85 new lobbyists in Washington, D.C. as registered lobbyists were either former staffers or family members of members of Congress. Now,
wow.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the scary part about it, because you and I, as the average voters, we don't have the access that these individuals do. They can pick up a telephone. They have the Rolodex. They have the direct lines in and out of Congress. And, you know, what I speak about this in the book. I was fortunate to go to one of these major political action committee cocktail parties. And this one happened to be for AIPAC, which is the American Israeli Political Action Committee, one of the most powerful in Washington, D.C. And there were 3,500 invitees to this. These were not members of Congress that were invited. Of course, they were invited as well. But the primary interest in the invitation was getting access to the political staffers, because they are the gatekeepers to the congressmen, their schedule, and who gets to see them, which places they go to make speeches, who does their fundraising, etc. So the average American doesn't seem to realize that these political action committees, and now we have super political action committees, they don't have to tell you who is donating the money. They don't have to tell you exactly where the money's going as soon as it's delivered. There is a delay in the reporting issue, and that's one of the problems with the law. There is a problem with the law. Certain things can be donated as outright gifts, and certain things can't be. And these are all issues that the American people need to be aware of, and I address them in the book.
Indeed, you do. You also provide an excellent list of the legislation that has been passed regarding legislative efforts to regulate lobbying. And you know what I found very informative, and pardon me, very informative, I'm just coming down with a bit of a cold here. Tom, you have very insightful proposals regarding lobbying, including preventing a bundled lobbying, and you propose a federal proportional cap on lobbying. You mentioned similar to that enacted by Minnesota. well, those are out-of-the-box proposals that seem very, very innovative to me. And even that bundled lobbying, that was an interesting term to me, too. Pardon me.
Thank you, Patrice. Yeah, these were all things that I researched in a great deal. And again, as I say, this is all public access information. There's no reason why the average American citizen can't find this stuff. All they have to do is go to Google, type it in, and the doors are wide open for you. The Internet provides that. But there are numerous state proposals and state actions that could be adopted by federal regulators regarding controlling and limiting lobbying, like the proposal in North Carolina, where lobbyists are not allowed to donate anything to anyone while they are during their legislative term. There are other proposals. I believe you mentioned Minnesota,
yes.
And the other state proposals that do not permit lobbyists to lobby their members of the legislature at all. Now, I live here in Texas, and Lord only knows, I thought Louisiana politics was bad. We used to refer to Louisiana politics as, America's banana republic. And the fact that Edwin Edwards again is running for Congress is just another prime example of what we meant by that. Texas is just as bad. And the scary part about it is that the voters are the controlling aspect of this. And we as American voters don't seem to realize it. We have the power. And, so many people come up to me and they go, well, my vote doesn't count. Yes, your vote doesn't count. I mean, it does count. Excuse me. I misspoke myself. Your vote does count. I mean, all you have to do is look at the past midterm elections. There was one Senate race, I believe it was in Iowa at one point, between Braley and Ernst, where they were only 7 votes apart. 7 votes. All you have to do is look at the fact that Eric Cantor, the former second most powerful member of the House of Representatives, was voted out of office. And Patrice, he was voted out of office by 11% of the electorate during the primary season. Only 11% of the voting populace voted him out of office. So you can't tell me that your vote doesn't count. Your vote doesn't count if you don't use it.
Those are very, very strong points. And, indeed, in your book, too, the readers will find an excellent discussion on the debt ceiling debate and why it's so important for our elected officials to effectively reduce the debt. You even mentioned the European Union's efforts to reduce the debt of its European member nations. I found that very interesting and informative as well. And, also, I can't wait to get to some of the other issues that you think must be addressed, and you propose very strong arguments for them by our legislators. Also, regarding current events, you really have some very interesting discussion there on such recent news stories as Snowden, Benghazi, and the IRS scandals, developments. Very interesting.
Thanks, Patricia. All you have to do, no one expected that Ebola was going to be the October surprise. For the average listener who may not be familiar with what is known as the October surprise, in campaigning, every campaign sits on pins and needles waiting for the October surprise. And basically what that is something that suddenly appears in mid to late October that you don't expect.
Really? It's not worth it.
No worries. I got this.
Well, this year it was Ebola. And, all you had to do the entire was panic over Ebola. Part of the reason panic over Ebola.
2 points.
Yes, it is a very dangerous disease.
7
and
gigahertz.
Devastating West Africa. But part of the problem was that the federal bureaucracy's ineptitude.
Kevlar fiber durability. Turbocharged for up to 8 hours of battery.
Bundled how it was handled. And then you
in just 15 minutes. Introducing Droid Turbo by Motorola.
standard is this, next week the standard's that. And so the average healthcare worker and the average patient out there is scared to death to go to their doctor's office as much as their hospital. I was supposed to go to a charity fundraising event in Dallas in late October, and I seriously questioned whether or not I was going to go because we didn't want to be exposed to something. Now, that just demonstrates right there, and I come from a medical family. I know what the potential for exposure was, but at the same time, you get scared. And the average person on the street gets scared when they hear about someone who is taken care of an Ebola patient, hops on an airplane, flies to Cleveland, and flies back. And when you see the doctors from the CDC and the NIH who are completely covered in head to toe in what look like, biotoxin, nuclear, fallout gear, and yet the nurses who are taking care of the Ebola patient have exposed skin. My mom's a registered nurse anesthetist, and thank God she's retired now. But I still have friends in the medical community, and it concerns me greatly. You now have the nurse who returned from West Africa and was immediately quarantined in New Jersey, and she fought it because she was not exposed to the success of what the science of this was. But this is what happens when you have politicians who are using the fear of the country to espouse their own political agendas. And this is what concerns me. The American people sit back and they have become so numbed and they've become so immune, they don't know the difference between fact and crap. And that was the reason I wrote Political Craps.
Indeed, and there are additional very important points there. Number one, Washington Post had an article, I think it was Wednesday, mentioning that there had been survey questions at some of the polling sites and that Ebola factored in prominent importance among the voters. And also you have Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, as a physician, being able to give interesting notes on Obama and that perhaps it could be more contagious than the CDC and others were portraying it. He had some great interviews and also a good article, too. I think his interviews were on CNN among other media. So those are very, very cogent, important points for the listeners and myself.
Yes.
And, also, when talking about current politicians who have been connected with the news in rather a controversial light, News on the Flip Side, which is the prior show, it's a very popular one on Saturday evenings. It's immediately prior to our show. It's a 4-hour show. There's a huge audience. But, several of the editions were mentioning the antics of Congressman Anthony Weiner of New York. And indeed, and you mentioned other political figures too, and you're right, they really have to act responsibly. And back on the really important issues to be addressed, boy, you noted several. First was America has to address the new global economy.
Yes. Okay, I know this is going to be scary for some people, and it may make some people angry, but here's the deal. Americans need to wake up and smell the coffee. What happened in 2007, 2008, with the quote-unquote Great Recession, not Great Depression, but Great Recession, that affected this country economically. And you see the transition in the labor statistics. Okay, now we're down below 6% unemployment. What those statistics and several of the economists and the pundits will point out to you is that you have a major dropout in the employment economy. In other words, people who have just given up and have stopped searching for jobs because the jobs aren't there. And the jobs that are there are part-time or a low wage. Now, what I am trying to emphasize to the American public is that we are transitioning from what is known as an industrial economy to an informational economy. And part of the problem is that a lot of the people that were involved in industrialization were not prepared for informationalization. They didn't have the technical resources, the technical knowledge, the technical education. And I'm one of those people. I'll be the first to admit it. Until I started writing, my experience with a computer was complete word processing. That's all I knew how to do. And I thank God that I've got some very brilliant people on my marketing team to help me with stuff. But this is part of the problem, and this is the reason we're being outpaced by other countries. America's education is now 17th in the world. It used to be number 1. And part of the problem is that we're not living up to the standards that the 21st century is requiring. And if we don't put the money and the standards necessary to modernize our schools, and that doesn't, just because you throw money at a problem doesn't mean you're going to solve it. So I'm not just saying money. But there need to be some major transitions in American education. One of the things that I think, and I propose this in several of my blog posts on my website, I talk about it on my radio program, I talk about it in the book, is that we need to return to vocational training in the public schools. We've gotten rid of that since we got rid of VOTEC or something similar to that. We no longer, we've gotten into this concept of everyone needs to go to college. Well, I'm a perfect example. I got a college education because my mind was wired that way. But let's face it, there are some people who are not wired academically for an academia education. They're more technically wired. And God bless them, because you know what? I am completely technically illiterate. That's the reason I hire people to take care of things for me like that. I can't tell the difference. For me, when I get in a car, I turn the key on, it goes. That's about as much as I know about a car. And now they're even more computerized. But the problem with the education system is we're not preparing our kids for the 21st century. We're not teaching our kids to think for themselves. And this is one of the areas that I address in the book that I think our legislators, both state and federal, need to address.
That's very innovative thinking, and to me it makes it tremendous. Your arguments there are very, very powerful. Great analysis there of both the problem and a way to address it. Also, you mentioned the need for improvement in our infrastructure at all levels.
Yes. When you sit back and I watch CNN, I watch NBC, CBS, I watch all the news programs regularly. My TV is constantly on the news. Now, I'm fortunate. I do not have a full-time job because I am physically disabled. And that's a whole other story. If you want to know about that, you can pick up my first book, Adversity Builds Character. That's not why I'm here today. But my point is this. I have the time to sit back and watch the news. And I know a lot of people say, I don't watch the news, I turn it off because it's all depressing. And I'll grant you it is. But to be a good citizen, you have to be an informed citizen. And you have to be an educated citizen. And part of the problem is that we're not teaching our kids to think for themselves. My parents taught me to yearn to learn rather than yearn to earn. And that's one of the things that I really stress in my public speaking engagements. I stress when I do speak at schools, look, money's important. It makes your life easier. It makes the world go round. But there's something more important to a good education than earning lots of money. It's what you do with it that counts in this world. And we're not teaching our kids to think anymore. They want to memorize rather than learn. I have this disagreement with younger people all the time. Why do I need to learn this? It's not going to make a difference to me. Anybody that listens to this program within the earshot of my voice can verify, what they learned in algebra and trigonometry in high school and college, when did they use it? Okay, I'll grant you that. But it is the theories behind it. It is the educational process of training your brain that teaches you to learn and yearn to learn. Everything is important. The day you stop learning is the day you die. And we have now an electorate that no longer yearns to find out what's going on. They are content to be commercialized and anesthetized, basically, by all of commercialization, and they're trying to get stuff to put in their homes, to put in their pockets. Everybody's got to have the biggest TV. Everybody's got to have the new curved TV. Everybody's got to have this. And the problem is that we are no longer focusing on the issues that address your very pocketbook, that address your child's education, that address, why is, gas in my car cheaper today, yet more expensive next week. All of these issues have fundamental importance, and they all relate to your votes. They all relate to who you elect and go to Congress, and they all relate to issues that most Americans are turned off by, and I get that. But we need a more informed and educated electorate, and I'm hoping that my book and my voice will help inspire that.
I think indeed it will, and indeed you really advocate that informed voters are really the best voters as far as selecting the best elected officials to promote America's welfare in this new global market and technological age, and to meet America's needs in this 21st century. And here, I hope I'm not being too simplistic, but it's wonderful, too, for people to be informed on the global scene as well. There's such threats now from such entities as ISIS, and we have Putin there annexing the Crimea. It's really such a fluid environment out there in the global scene. Really, the voters have to be informed.
Oh, absolutely, Patrice. And, that's my area of expertise is international affairs. And so I watch that constantly. Just this week, I don't know if anyone saw the news reports this morning and yesterday. The president has proposed another 1,500 soldiers, advisors, going to Iraq. What most Americans do not realize is that announcement was made yesterday. Okay, the soldiers have already been stationed in Kuwait for weeks. They waited until after the election to make the announcement because they didn't want that to be debated during the election process. The soldiers have already been transitioned and are waiting to go into Iraq. So the decision was made a while back. It just wasn't announced until yesterday. That's factual. And, people sit back and they go, well, what does that mean to me? What does that mean to the average American halfway around the world? Well, ask yourself this question. Is your son or daughter in uniform? Okay? Is this mission creep? Now, what is mission creep? Mission creep is a term that refers to the gradual increase of the number of advisors, the number of soldiers, the number of technicians that we have involved in a military mission abroad. Mission creep was originally termed and developed when it came to Vietnam. Mission creep started out in the late 1950s when President Eisenhower first sent advisors to Vietnam. Then Kennedy increased the advisors, and in 1963, before he was assassinated, he was campaigning to withdraw those advisors. Then there was the great assassination in Vietnam of the South Vietnamese president, and we became more intertwined and involved in Vietnam with Lyndon Baines Johnson. It gradually increased with Nixon and the bombings in Laos and Cambodia. So, these are all historical facts, and this is where mission creep comes from. So we have now removed our troops from Iraq, but now they're gradually going back in. And you have to ask yourself this question. Okay, we've been told the soldiers, are going to be safe on bases inside and away from the combat zone. Well, that's true. But where is ISIS attacking? ISIS is attacking bases in Iraq. So what happens if they suddenly get a car bomb into one of those bases and they kill 40 or 50 of our soldiers? Do you honestly think that the American government is going to lie down and take that idly by? No, they're going to increase the number for protection. The largest embassy in the world is in Baghdad. We built it, thanks to the Bush administration. It is the largest American embassy in the world, and it's in Baghdad. And it is housed and worked at by thousands of American staff and contractors. So those people have to be protected. Now, let's face it. From the very beginning, ISIS, when we started this air campaign, military officials were saying airstrikes are not going to be enough. We need troops on the ground, boots on the ground. Now, boots on the ground is a term that has just been thrown about very nonchalantly, and, you know, the American people have become numb to it. Well, boots on the ground doesn't necessarily mean boots on the ground. You have to remember that we have, what was it? We've flown over, I think it's nearly 700 sorties of airdrops, of bombings in Syria and Iraq. Now, who are the people that support those sorties? You've got the people that support them on the bases in our allies within the coalition. You've got them on the aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. And so all of these are people, tens of thousands of people, that aren't necessarily boots on the ground, but they support the mission. And these are things that the American people need to be aware of. And yes, you need to be concerned about ISIS. They may be several tens of thousands of miles away, but there are members of ISIS that are American citizens or European citizens that have the capacity to come back to this country. Now, the terrorist that was just killed with the Khorasan group, they announced they believe they've killed him. They haven't guaranteed it, but they believe he's killed. I don't know if the average American realizes this man was trying to perfect explosive clothing.
What a horror. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. He was trying to perfect clothing that was of an explosive material that could easily pass through the protection, the screening and the protections for airplanes, but that could be detonated on an airplane. That was his job. That was what he was perfecting. So if we got him, and I hope and pray we did, these are the kinds of people that we're fighting. Now, the Khorasan and ISIS are not allied, but they're in the same country. And if they ever decide to ally, we're in trouble. ISIS is now more concerned about creating the Great Caliphate, which is, you know, I tend to agree with American administrative ideas that this is not America's fight, okay? The countries in the Middle East need to be involved in this. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, the states in the Persian Gulf, all need to be involved with this because this is their backyard. So I agree with that. But at the same time, we're going to have to deal with whatever comes out of that. And, you know, the American people need to be concerned about international issues because these affect what happens here at home. They affect the stock market. They affect your gas prices. They affect your pocketbook. They affect your sons and daughters abroad in uniform. All of these things affect you. So you can't simply say, well, just because, you know, that's across the ocean around halfway around the globe, it doesn't affect me. That is baloney. It does affect you. I'm sorry, I've been ranting, Patrice. I keep going.
No, I'll tell you, I think your comments have been brilliant, very, very helpful. And I've learned a great deal from this discussion. It's been a very highly informative discussion, and I do hope you'll very seriously consider being a return guest, Tom. I'd love to see you as a frequent return guest.
Oh, Patrice, that would be an honor. I would love to. Thank you.
And now I wanted to mention again to our listening audience, you can find your website. You can find Tom's website at Tom Ufert, TOMUFERT.com, and his Facebook page can be found at Facebook again, www.facebook.com/Tom Ufert author. And now your latest book, Political Craft's Excellent Read, can be found at Amazon.com in both text and Kindle versions, and all your books can be found at Amazon.com, and they've been received very, very well.
Just to let you know, the audio version of Political Crafts will be coming out next week. And, you know, as you said in the introduction, all of my books donate to charity in some way or another. 10% of all my royalties from Political Crafts will be donated to the disabled American vets, and 10% of all of my audiobook royalties is being donated to the Perkins School for the Blind in Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, that's a wonderful organization as well. I think they had a related one up near Boston, near Watertown, Massachusetts. A wonderful organization. Now, Tom, again, for our listeners who might have missed it, could you mention details on your news segment there in the New York, New Jersey area?
Oh, yes. It's called The Lean Freak Show, and it appears on every Thursday. The program actually appears, and you can go to Lean, L-E-A-N, Freak Show, FreakShow.com, and go to weekly shows, and you'll see it's called Talking Politics with Tom Thursdays. And every Thursday I do my Tom's Take, which is about a 1,500-word monologue, and then we go into a discussion. There's a phone number there for you to contact us, and you can call in, and we'd love to have people call in. And you don't have to be just from New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Maryland or New York. Anybody across the country can call in. And I also have a petition on change.org. I'm trying to get CNN, NBC, CBS, and ABC to interview me about my book and about my attempts to get the American voters inspired. So if you want to go and sign that petition, I would be deeply grateful.
Oh, indeed, I shall. I know that's another great initiative, and again, your proposals are very insightful. And do you have any final words here to the audience? For the audience, right?
Yeah. Let me tell you, my final words are this: my fellow Americans, look, this country is our country, and your votes do count. If you are as dissatisfied with what happened on Tuesday after the elections, everyone's saying, we needed to have cooperation and we needed to get rid of partisan gridlock, and then you saw what happened within the next 48 hours. The same political leaders are still bickering and still arguing with each other, and you sit back and you go, well, nothing's going to change. Well, that's our fault, okay? Things that aren't changing are not changing because we have the power and we didn't do something about it. That's what my book's about. That's what my upcoming books are about, and I hope and pray that you'll pick them up and you'll get some good read out of it, plus your money goes to good causes. So that's my thought.
Tom, thank you again for honoring us as a guest. And again, we very much want you to be a return guest, sir. I've learned a great deal from both your book and this wonderful discussion, both superb. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us, and a wonderful evening to you, Tom, and also to our listeners. Thank you again.
And thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, sir. Thank you again.
We were doing from 7
dares to go. Join me every week for the Rob Simone Talk Show here on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network.